Shut him up, Savannah. This is a place of respect, not a playground for your brat's tantrums. Arthur pointed to the exit. You were never one of us, he hissed. I am Savannah, and I am 34 years old. I have spent the last decade working as a pediatric nurse, which taught me how to stay calm when everything is falling apart. My husband David was the light of my life, but he came from a high society real estate family that never saw me as a peer. To them, I was just a girl from a working-class background who did not belong in their polished world. I was the quiet daughter-in-law who stayed in the kitchen while Arthur and Brenda toasted to their own greatness. I watched from the shadows as they praised themselves for wealth they did not actually build. After David passed, I was left navigating deep grief while trying to protect my son Leo. This family saw him as an inconvenience rather than a grandson. Arthur thought I was just a grieving widow with no money or power. He was wrong. I had something they did not expect. I had my husband's complete and total honesty. If your family made you feel like you were not enough, subscribe to this community. Drop your story below because you are not alone. Let's go. Click hype or like to let me know you are here. I am reading every single comment you leave today. The air in the church was freezing, but the heat from Arthur's glare felt like it could burn through my skin. I sat on the hard wooden pew with my hands shaking in my lap. David was gone. My husband, the man who had been my rock for 12 years, was lying in a casket just a few feet away from me. The silence of the room was heavy, filled with the smell of too many expensive lilies and the damp scent of wet wool coats. Everyone was dressed in black, but Arthur looked like he was attending a board meeting rather than his son's funeral. He stood tall with his silver hair perfectly combed and his expensive suit pressed without a single wrinkle. He did not look like a man who had lost a child. He looked like a man who was bothered by an interruption. Next to me, Leo was struggling. He is only 7 years old. He does not understand why his father is in a box. He does not understand why the world feels so cold all of a sudden. He started to sob, a small and high-pitched sound that broke my heart into a million pieces. I pulled him close, trying to muffle the sound against my shoulder, but the church was built for echoes. Every little gasp for air bounced off the high stone ceilings. That was when Arthur turned around. He did not offer a hand or a kind word. He did not look at his grandson with any pity. He just looked disgusted. "Shut him up, Savannah," he barked. His voice was a sharp blade that sliced through the organ music. "This is a place of respect, not a playground for your brat's tantrums." I felt the eyes of every person in the building turn toward us. My face burned with a mix of shame and pure, white-hot anger. I looked at Arthur, hoping to see a shred of humanity, but there was nothing. He was staring at the back door. He was actually pointing at it. He wanted us to leave David's service. He wanted to remove the embarrassment of a grieving child so he could maintain the image of a perfect, dignified family. I did not want to cause a scene, but my legs felt like lead. I stood up slowly, keeping my arm around Leo's shaking shoulders. As I started to lead my son down the center aisle, the silence was deafening. I could hear the clicks of my own heels on the marble floor. When I passed Arthur, he did not even look away from the casket. He just leaned in close as I moved by him. "You were never one of us," he whispered. The words were low and hissed like a snake. "And now you are officially nothing." I did not respond. I could not. If I had opened my mouth, I would have screamed. I walked out into the gray afternoon rain, holding Leo as he cried into my coat. We sat in my old sedan for a long time, watching the expensive cars line up outside the church. I knew that after the service, there would be a luncheon at the family estate. It was a massive house that David and I rarely visited because the atmosphere always felt like poison. I knew I had to go. I had to go because David would have wanted me to stand my ground. I had to go because if I did not show up, Arthur would win. He would think he had successfully wiped us out of his life before the body was even in the ground. The drive to the estate took 20 minutes. The rain was coming down harder now, blurring the windshield. Leo had fallen into a quiet, exhausted sleep in the back seat. I looked at him in the rearview mirror and made a promise. I promised him that no matter what Arthur said, he was David's son. He had a right to be there. I straightened my dress and wiped my eyes. I was a nurse. I had seen people at their worst. I had handled emergencies and dealt with life and death every single day. I could handle a room full of people who thought they were better than me. When I arrived at the gates of the estate, the security guard paused. He looked at my car and then at his clipboard. I could see the hesitation in his eyes. He knew who I was, but he also knew who signed his paychecks. After a long moment, he buzzed the gate open. I drove up the long, winding driveway lined with perfectly trimmed hedges. The house was a monument to wealth. It was all white stone and massive glass windows. It looked beautiful from the outside, but I knew the inside was hollow. I parked at the far end of the lot, far away from the shiny black SUVs and sports cars. I woke Leo up gently. He looked small and tired, but he took my hand and walked beside me toward the front doors. As soon as I stepped inside, the smell of expensive catering hit me. There was the scent of roasted meat and fine wine. People were gathered in small groups, talking in hushed tones that sounded more like gossip than grief. I saw Brenda, David's sister, standing near the grand staircase. She was the favorite child, the one Arthur always praised for her business mind, which really just meant she was just as cold as he was. She was wearing a designer black dress that probably cost more than my car. When she saw us, she did not smile. She did not even acknowledge Leo. She just walked over to a table where a group of family friends were sitting. I looked for a place to sit, but the main dining room was already full. Every chair at the long, formal table was occupied. I saw several empty seats near the middle, right where the immediate family should be. I started to walk toward them, thinking that perhaps the family had left a spot for David's widow and son. Just as I reached for a chair, David's other sister, Sarah, reached out and pulled the chair away. She did not look at me. She just placed her handbag on the seat. The movement was so deliberate and so cruel that I froze. I looked at the table and realized that every person sitting there was a blood relative or a high-level business partner. Brenda looked up at me then, her eyes narrow and sharp. The family table is for blood relatives and contributors to the legacy, Savannah, she sneered. Her voice was loud enough that the entire room went quiet. I think there might be some space in the sunroom for the staff and the extra guests. You should check there. I felt the sting of her words in my chest. She was calling me an extra guest at my own husband's memorial luncheon. She was treating me like I was the help. I looked down at Leo, who was staring up at me with wide, confused eyes. He could feel the tension. He could feel the hate in the room. I felt a surge of protectiveness that outweighed my hurt. I was about to say something, to tell her exactly where she could put her handbag, when the front of the room went dark. Arthur stepped into the center of the dining hall. He held a glass of champagne in one hand. He cleared his throat, and the room became deathly still. He did not look like a man in mourning. He looked like a king addressing his subjects. He began to talk about David, but he did not talk about the man David was. He did not talk about his kindness or his love for his son. He talked about David as a missed opportunity for the company. He talked about legacy and protecting the family brand. It was a cold, corporate eulogy that made my stomach turn. Then he turned his gaze toward me. It was not a look of comfort. It was a look of execution. As we moved forward, Arthur said, his voice echoing off the marble walls, "We must ensure the family assets are protected." David was a good man, but he was sometimes too generous with things that did not belong to him. I frowned, not understanding what he was implying. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. "It has come to my attention," Arthur continued, "that there is some confusion regarding the family home on Oak Street. To be clear, that house belongs to the family corporation. It was never David's to give away. I expect the property to be vacated by the end of the month so we can prepare it for a more suitable occupant." I felt like the floor had vanished beneath me. That was my home. That was where Leo had taken his first steps. That was the only thing David and I truly owned together. I took a step forward, my voice trembling but clear. "That house is mine, Arthur," I said. "David signed the deed over to me 3 years ago. We have the paperwork." Arthur laughed. It was a dry, rattling sound that lacked any real humor. He looked around the room, inviting everyone else to join in his mockery. "Savannah, David was a dreamer," Arthur said, stepping closer to me. "But he was also a man who knew his responsibilities. That deed you think you have is a forgery. My lawyers have already looked into it. David was actually planning to divorce you before he died. He wanted his assets back in the family name where they belong." The room erupted into whispers. I could hear people gasping and murmuring. They were looking at me with pity and judgment. I felt the walls closing in. This was a lie. David loved me. He would never have divorced me. Arthur was standing there, in front of everyone we knew, and he was destroying my life and my husband's memory with a single, calculated lie. I looked around the room for one friendly face, but I found none. They all believed him. Or even if they did not, they were too afraid of him to speak up. Arthur signaled to a group of men in white uniforms standing by the door. "I think it is time for the guests who are not on the list to leave," Arthur said. "Catering, please escort them out." I felt the hand of a stranger on my arm. I was being kicked out of my family's house, out of my home, and out of my life. I looked at Arthur one last time. He had a look of triumph on his face. He thought he had won. He thought I was just a girl with nothing. But as I walked out that door for the second time that day, I remembered something. I remembered the small, black folder David had kept in the back of our closet. I remembered the way he had looked at me 2 weeks before he died. I had the truth, and soon I would have much more. The rain did not stop that night. It felt like the sky was mourning with me, even if David's family was not. I drove home with Leo, who was still quiet in the back seat. He had fallen asleep again, exhausted by the weight of things a 7-year-old should never have to carry. I looked at the dark house as we pulled into the driveway. This was the place where we had built our life. We had picked out the paint for the walls. We had planted the rose bushes that were now drooping under the weight of the water. Arthur wanted to take this from us. He wanted to take the roof from over our heads and the ground from under our feet. I carried Leo inside and put him to bed. I sat in the kitchen for hours, staring at the phone. I wanted to call David. I wanted to hear his voice and tell him that his father was being a monster. But David was gone. I was alone in this fight. The next morning, I had to go to work. I am a pediatric nurse, and children do not stop getting sick just because my world has ended. I walked into the hospital and felt the familiar smell of antiseptic and floor wax. It is a sterile smell that usually makes me feel like I am in control. But today, it just felt cold. My coworkers were kind. They offered hugs and coffee, but I could tell they did not know what to say. How do you talk to a woman whose father-in-law just told her she was nothing? I spent the day checking temperatures and hanging IV bags. I focused on the work because it was the only thing that made sense. I knew how to fix a fever. I knew how to comfort a scared child. I did not know how to stop a billionaire from stealing my life. The bitterness in my mouth was like a copper coin. I could not swallow it. When I got home that evening, the house felt different. It felt like someone had been there. I walked into the living room and saw that the pictures on the mantel had been moved. I ran upstairs to Leo's room. He was with the nanny in the kitchen, so I was alone in his room. I looked at his bedside table. The small wooden box was open. David's gold watch was gone. It was a watch that had belonged to his grandfather. It was the only piece of jewelry David wore every single day. He had left it for Leo. I felt a cold knot of panic in my stomach. I ran downstairs and asked the nanny who had been there. She looked at me with wide, nervous eyes. "It was Brenda," she said. She said she was here to collect some of David's personal items for the estate. She told me she had permission from Mr. Arthur. I did not know what to do, Savannah. She was very forceful. I felt a surge of rage that made my vision blur. Brenda was the favorite child who always got what she wanted. She had walked into my home and stolen from my son. She had taken a piece of his father while he was still grieving. I picked up the phone to call her, but I stopped. If I called her, I would give her the satisfaction of knowing she had hurt me. She wanted me to scream. She wanted me to lose my mind so they could use it against me. I took a deep breath and looked at the nanny. "It is not your fault," I told her. "But from now on, no one enters this house unless I am here." A few days later, the real pressure began. I went to the grocery store to get milk and bread. When I swiped my card, it was declined. I tried another one, declined again. I felt the heat rising in my neck as the people in line behind me started to grumble. I knew I had money in that account. David and I had been careful. We had a joint account for our daily lives. I left the groceries on the counter and walked out. I sat in my car and called the bank. The woman on the other end was polite, but her words were like ice. "I am sorry, Mrs. Miller," she said. "But the primary account holder, Mr. Arthur Miller, has placed a hold on all joint accounts pending an estate audit. We cannot release any funds at this time." I told her that was my money too. I told her I worked for that money. She just repeated the same line. Arthur had frozen everything. He had locked me out of my own life. I checked the mail when I got home and found a letter from Leo's school. His tuition was past due. I found another letter from the mortgage company. The payment had not gone through. Arthur was trying to starve me out. He was trying to make it impossible for me to survive, so I would have to crawl back to him and beg for help. He wanted to prove that I was weak. He wanted to show everyone that I could not provide for my son without the family name. But the worst blow came on a Friday afternoon. I was at the hospital, finishing a double shift. A man in a cheap suit walked up to the nursing station and asked for me. He handed me a thick envelope. I opened it and felt the air leave my lungs. It was a legal notice. Arthur was filing for emergency custody of Leo. The papers were filled with lies. They said I was financially unstable. They said I was suffering from a mental breakdown due to grief. They said that Leo was in danger because I could not provide a stable home. They called me unfit. They called me a danger to my own child. They even used the fact that I worked long hours as a nurse against me. They said I was never home. I sat down on a plastic chair in the hallway and cried. I cried because I was tired. I cried because it was not fair. I cried because David was not there to protect us. The sound of the hospital machines beeping was the only thing I could hear over my own breathing. But then, I stopped. I looked at the papers and saw Arthur's signature. It was a messy, arrogant scrawl. He thought he was untouchable. He thought I was just a quiet girl who would break under pressure. He did not realize that a nurse is trained to handle pressure. He did not realize that I had spent years watching him and Brenda. I knew how they worked. I knew they were built on lies and mirrors. I went back to the nursing station and picked up the phone. I did not call Arthur. I did not call Brenda. I called a number that David had given me a long time ago. He had told me that if anything ever happened to him, I should call this man. He said this man was the only one who knew the truth about the family business. He said this man was the black sheep of the legal world, but he was honest. I waited as the phone rang. Each ring sounded like a bell in a quiet room. Finally, a man answered. "Hello," he said. His voice was old and gravelly. "Mr. Henderson." I asked. "This is Savannah, David's wife." There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear the sound of paper rustling. Then he spoke again. His voice was softer now. "I have been waiting for your call, Savannah," he said. "I am so sorry about David. He was a good man. He was much better than the people he came from. He was the only one in that family who had a heart. I told him everything. I told him about the funeral. I told him about the house and the frozen accounts. I told him about the custody papers and Brenda stealing the watch. I could hear him sighing on the other end. It was a tired, heavy sound. "Arthur is a bully," Savannah Henderson said. "He has been a bully his whole life. He thinks money can buy silence and loyalty. But David knew that. David spent years preparing for this day. He knew his father would try to erase you the moment he was gone. He knew Brenda would try to take whatever she could get her hands on." "What do I do?" I asked. I felt a tiny spark of hope in my chest. It was the first time I had felt anything other than despair in days. "You keep your head down," Henderson told me. "You do not fight him in the streets. You do not let him see you cry. I am going to send you some instructions. There is a safety deposit box at the downtown branch. David left something there for you. It is something Arthur does not know about. It is something that will change everything. It is the secret he thought he buried with David." I hung up the phone and felt a strange sense of calm. The hospital was still busy. The machines were still beeping. The patients still needed me. But for the first time in weeks, I did not feel like a victim. I felt like a soldier. Arthur and Brenda thought they were playing a game of chess against a child. They did not realize I had already seen their next 10 moves. I went back to work and finished my shift. I went home and hugged Leo. I told him that everything was going to be okay. I told him that his father had taken care of us in ways we did not even know yet. The next few days were a blur of secret meetings and phone calls. I had to be careful. I knew Arthur was watching me. He probably had private investigators following my car. He probably had people checking my trash. I acted like the grieving, broken woman he wanted me to be. I went to work. I went to the store. I looked sad and tired. I let the neighbors see me carrying boxes as if I were preparing to leave. But inside, I was burning. I was waiting for the right moment to strike. I was waiting for the meeting that Arthur had called. He wanted to meet at his law firm to discuss the relinquishment of my rights. He thought I was going to sign the papers and go away quietly. I sat in my dark kitchen on the night before the meeting. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. It was a steady, rhythmic sound that reminded me that time was moving. Arthur's time was running out. I had the key to the safety deposit box in my hand. It was cold and heavy. I thought about David. I thought about the man who had loved me enough to protect me even after he was gone. He had seen the darkness in his own father. He had seen the greed in his sister, and he had made sure they would never win. I am not just a nurse anymore, I whispered to the empty room. I am the storm that is coming for you, Arthur. You thought you could take everything from me, but you forgot that I have nothing left to fear. You forgot that I am David's wife. I stood up and went to bed. I slept better that night than I had since the funeral. I knew that tomorrow would be the day the world shifted. I knew that tomorrow, the favorite child and the arrogant patriarch would find out exactly who I was. They would find out that you should never underestimate a woman who has nothing left to lose but her son. They would find out that David's honesty was the most powerful weapon in the world. I woke up before the sun came out on the day I was supposed to visit the bank. The house was cold, and the silence felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I sat in the kitchen with a single light on, watching the steam rise from my coffee cup. My mind was racing, replaying every cruel thing Arthur and Brenda had said to me over the last week. They wanted me to believe I was small. They wanted me to believe that my marriage to David was a mistake, and that I had no place in their world. But as I touched the cold, heavy key in my pocket, I knew that David had left me a map out of this darkness. He had spent years watching his father's greed and his sister's vanity, and he had built a fortress around me that they didn't even know existed. I wasn't just Savannah, the nurse who lived in the kitchen. I was the person David trusted with everything he actually valued. The drive to the downtown branch of the bank was long and gray. The city was waking up, but everything looked like it was filtered through a layer of dust. I parked my old car between two shiny luxury vehicles and felt a familiar sting of being the outsider. I walked into the bank, and the sound of my shoes on the polished floor seemed too loud. The air inside was still and smelled like metallic coins and ozone. I asked to see the manager for the safety deposit boxes. A man in a sharp suit led me downstairs into the vault. It was a massive room filled with thousands of small steel doors. Each one held a secret. Each one held a piece of someone's life. When he found the box labeled with the number David had given me, my hands started to shake. I slid my key into the lock and heard a heavy, mechanical click. It was the sound of a door opening that Arthur thought had been sealed forever. I pulled the box out and carried it to a small, private room. I sat down and opened the lid. I expected to find jewelry or maybe some cash, but what I found was much more powerful. There were stacks of legal documents, titles to properties I had never heard of, and a thick, handwritten letter from David. I picked up the letter first. His handwriting was messy and familiar, and seeing it made my eyes fill with tears. He told me that he knew Arthur would try to break me. He told me that his father had never truly loved him, only the idea of control. David explained that he had spent years taking his bonuses and his private investments and moving them into a separate entity that his father couldn't touch. He had bought the building where Arthur's firm was located. He had bought the land under the family estate. He didn't just leave me a house. He left me the very ground Arthur stood on. I spent hours reading through the papers. There were bank statements for accounts in my name that I didn't even know existed. There were records of every dollar David had put into the family business to keep it from sinking. Arthur had been telling everyone that David was a dreamer who didn't understand money, but the truth was that David was the only reason the Miller name still meant anything. Without David's secret injections of cash, Arthur and Brenda would have been bankrupt years ago. I felt a cold, hard sense of confidence start to grow inside me. I wasn't going to beg for a place at their table. I was going to realize that I owned the table, the chairs, and the house they sat in. I packed everything back into the box, but I kept the most important documents in my bag. I was ready to see Mr. Henderson. Mr. Henderson's office was located in an old part of the city, in a building that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1950s. I walked up 3 flights of stairs and opened a heavy oak door. The room had a very specific smell. It was the smell of old books and dust, mixed with a hint of peppermint and pipe tobacco. It was a smell that reminded me of safety. Mr. Henderson was sitting behind a desk piled high with folders. He looked up and smiled, and for the first time since David died, I felt like I was looking at a friend. He didn't see me as a poor widow or a social climber. He saw me as David's partner. He stood up and offered me a chair, his movements slow and deliberate. "Savannah, I am glad you found what you were looking for," he said. His voice was like gravel, but it was kind. David was very careful about how he set this up. He knew that Arthur has a way of making people feel like they have no options, but you have more options than anyone in that family right now. We spent the next 3 hours going through the documents I had brought. Henderson explained that Arthur had been using the family trust like his own personal piggy bank. He had been taking money meant for the company and spending it on Brenda's exotic vacations and designer clothes. He thought that because David was gone, there was no one left to look at the books. He thought he could just fold David's personal assets into the trust to cover up the holes he had dug. Henderson showed me a ledger that David had kept. It was a record of every time Arthur had lied to the board of directors. It was a map of a decade of fraud. I felt a chill as I realized how deep the rot went. Arthur wasn't just a mean man. He was a criminal who was using my husband's death to hide his crimes. The tension in the room grew as Henderson laid out the plan. He told me that Arthur had called a mandatory meeting for Monday morning. Arthur wanted me to sign a global settlement. In his mind, this was the final blow. He was going to offer me a small amount of money in exchange for me giving up the house, the custody of Leo, and any future claims to the Miller estate. He thought I was broke and desperate. He thought that by freezing my cards, he had forced me into a corner where I would sign anything just to buy groceries for my son. I looked at Henderson, and I felt a smile touch my lips for the first time in weeks. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind of smile a person has when they are about to win a fight they didn't start. He thinks he is the predator, I said, my voice steady and cold, but he is just a man standing on a bridge that is already on fire. Henderson nodded and leaned back in his chair. Exactly. He has no idea that David owned the firm's lease. He has no idea that the family home he keeps talking about was actually foreclosed on 5 years ago, and David bought it back through a private company. Arthur has been living in a house owned by his daughter-in-law for years without even knowing it. He is going to walk into that meeting thinking he is the king, but he is going to find out he doesn't even own the throne. But we have to be careful, Savannah. Arthur is a cornered animal, and those are the most dangerous. He will try to bully you. He will try to make you feel like a bad mother. He will say things that will make you want to scream. You have to stay quiet until I give the signal. I promised him I would. I left his office as the sun was setting, casting long, orange shadows across the pavement. I went home and made dinner for Leo. I watched him eat his pasta, his small face still carrying the traces of sadness that hadn't left him since the funeral. I looked at the walls of our house, the house Arthur said wasn't mine. I thought about Brenda taking David's watch. I thought about the way they had laughed at me in front of all their friends. The bitterness I had felt for weeks was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. I wasn't just fighting for money or for a building. I was fighting for Leo's future and for David's honor. They had tried to turn David into a ghost, a failure who couldn't take care of his family. I was going to show them that David was the strongest man they had ever known. That night, the phone rang. It was Brenda. Her voice was light and fake, like she was talking to a child. She told me that she had found some of my old things in the attic, and that I should come pick them up before the new owners moved into our house. She mentioned that Arthur was very worried about my mental health, and that they were already looking at boarding schools for Leo, to help him through this transition. She was trying to rattle me. She was trying to make me feel the walls closing in. I didn't get angry. I didn't cry. I just listened to her breathe on the other end of the line. "Thank you for the call, Brenda," I said. "I will see you at the meeting on Monday. I hope you're wearing something you like. It's going to be a very long day." I hung up before she could respond. I could almost picture her face, confused and annoyed that she hadn't gotten the reaction she wanted. She thought she was the prized child, the one they always praised for being so clever and so much better than me. She had no idea that her world was built on a foundation of sand, and the tide was finally coming in. I went to Leo's room and tucked him in. I sat by his bed for a long time, listening to him breathe. Tomorrow was Sunday, the last day of the old life Arthur thought I was stuck in. Monday was the day everything would change. I was ready. I had the documents, I had the ally, and most importantly, I had the truth. The silence of the house on Sunday morning was different than it had been all week. Usually, the quiet felt like it was suffocating me, but today, it felt like a shield. I sat on the floor of David's office, surrounded by the boxes that Brenda had told me to pack. She thought she was winning because she had forced me to put my life into cardboard containers. She didn't realize that every time I taped a box shut, I was just making it easier for me to walk away from their shadow. I spent the morning looking at old photos of David. There was one of him holding Leo for the first time. He looked so happy and so terrified at the same time. He was a man who wanted to be better than his father. He was a man who worked late every night not because he loved the money, but because he wanted to buy our freedom. I realized then that David had been fighting this war for years. He just hadn't told me because he didn't want the dirt of his family to touch my life. I spent most of the afternoon on the phone with Mr. Henderson. We went over every detail of the documents I had found in the safety deposit box. He explained that the family trust was actually a shell. Arthur had used it to hide the fact that the main real estate company was bleeding money. Brenda had been using the company credit cards to buy jewelry and art, and Arthur had been covering it up by selling off small pieces of the family legacy. They were living like royalty on a sinking ship. Henderson told me that David had seen the end coming. That was why he had started his own private investment firm. He had used his personal earnings to buy the debt of Arthur's company. He didn't do it to save his father. He did it so that one day, he could decide if the company lived or died. Now, that decision belonged to me. Henderson's voice was steady as he explained the legal mechanics of the meeting. "Savannah, you have to understand that Arthur is going to use every trick in the book," he said. I could hear the sound of his pen scratching against paper on the other end. "He is going to call you names. He is going to tell you that you are hurting Leo by not cooperating. He might even threaten to call the police. You have to stay perfectly still. Don't defend yourself. Don't explain your side. Just wait for me to speak." I told him I understood. I felt a coldness settling into my bones. It wasn't the coldness of fear. It was the coldness of a nurse preparing for a difficult surgery. You have to disconnect your emotions to do the job right. By Sunday evening, the house was mostly empty. I had moved the important things to a storage unit that Arthur didn't know about. I kept only the essentials for me and Leo. I made a simple dinner and sat with my son at the small kitchen table. He was coloring a picture of a superhero. He looked up at me and asked if we were going to see Grandpa Arthur soon. I felt a pang of guilt, but I kept my face calm. "We are going to a meeting tomorrow, Leo," I told him. "It might be a little boring, so you are going to stay with Mrs. Gable for the morning. After that, everything is going to change. We are going on a big adventure." He smiled and went back to his coloring. He trusted me completely. That trust was the most valuable thing I owned, and I wasn't going to let Arthur Miller break it. I couldn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the house. I heard the wind rattling the window frames and the distant hum of traffic from the highway. I thought about Brenda and the way she had always been the favorite. She was the one they always praised for being so sophisticated and so much better than a common nurse. I wondered if she knew how close she was to losing everything. I wondered if she realized that her designer clothes were paid for with money that David had worked himself to death to protect. Probably not. People like Brenda don't look at the foundation of the buildings they live in. They only look at the view from the window. I felt a sense of pity for her, but it was quickly replaced by the memory of her pulling that chair away from Leo at the funeral. Pity was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. Monday morning arrived with a sharp, clear sky. It was a beautiful day for a fight. I got up and dressed with extreme care. I didn't wear the black dress of a mourning widow. I chose a sharp, navy blue suit that I had bought for a hospital fundraiser years ago. It made me feel tall and professional. I pulled my hair back into a tight, neat bun. I looked in the mirror and didn't see a victim. I saw a woman who knew the truth. I dropped Leo off at the neighbor's house and drove toward the city center. The high-rise building, where Arthur's law firm was located, was made of black glass and steel. It looked like a giant obsidian pillar rising out of the ground. I parked in the garage and took the elevator to the 40th floor. The sound of the elevator was a low, constant hum. My ears popped as we rose higher and higher. When the doors opened, I stepped into a lobby that felt like a museum. There were original paintings on the walls and marble statues in the corners. The receptionist looked at me with a bored expression until I gave my name. Then, her eyes widened slightly. She knew who I was. Word had clearly traveled through the office that the unstable widow was coming in to sign away her life. She told me to wait in the conference room at the end of the hall. I walked down the carpeted hallway, listening to the muffled sounds of people working in their private offices. It was a world of whispers and secret deals. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the conference room. The room was massive, with a long table made of dark wood that looked like it had been carved from a single tree. Arthur was already there, sitting at the head of the table. Brenda was next to him, looking at her phone and tapping her long, manicured nails against the wood. The sound was like a tiny hammer hitting a nail. Talk, talk, talk. There were two other men in suits sitting across from them. I assumed they were the family trust lawyers. They didn't look at me when I walked in. They just kept looking at their tablets and whispering. "You're late," Arthur said without looking up. He was wearing a dark gray suit that looked like armor. He had a stack of papers in front of him and a silver pen in his hand. "I am exactly on time," I said. My voice was louder than I expected, and it echoed in the large room. I took a seat at the far end of the table, as far away from Arthur as possible. I didn't put my bag on the table. I kept it in my lap. Brenda looked up from her phone and gave me a fake, sugary smile. "We just want to get this over with, Savannah. We have a lot of work to do today, and I'm sure you want to go back to your little clinic. We've prepared a very generous offer for you. It's more than you're worth, honestly, but Dad wants to be fair because of David." Arthur slid a thick document across the polished wood. It stopped right in front of me. "This is the global settlement," he said. "It covers the house, the custody arrangements for Leo, and your final exit from the Miller family interests. You sign this, and we give you a check for $10,000. You can use it to find a nice apartment in a different part of town. We've already found a school for Leo that will provide the structure he's clearly missing. It's best for everyone if we just move on." I looked down at the paper. The first page was filled with legal jargon about voluntary relinquishment and non-disclosure agreements. They wanted to pay me $10,000 to disappear and never speak David's name again. They wanted to take my son and put him in a boarding school because they thought I was a distraction to their brand. I felt a cold, sharp laugh bubble up in my chest, but I kept it down. I didn't look at the paper. I looked at Arthur. "Where is my lawyer?" I asked. Arthur scoffed. "You don't need a lawyer for this, Savannah. This is a family matter. Besides, we both know you can't afford a real attorney. The hospital doesn't pay that well, and your accounts are currently under audit. Don't make this difficult. Just sign the paper so we can all go home." Just then, the doors behind me opened. The sound of heavy footsteps on the carpet made Brenda turn around. Mr. Henderson walked in, carrying an old leather briefcase that looked like it had been through a war. He didn't look like the high-priced lawyers sitting at the table. He looked like a man who knew where the bodies were buried. He didn't say hello. He just walked to the chair next to me and sat down. He placed his briefcase on the table with a heavy thud. "She has a lawyer," Arthur, Henderson said. His voice was like a low rumble of thunder. "And we aren't here to sign that piece of trash you just slid across the table." Arthur's face turned a deep shade of red. "Henderson, what are you doing here? You were retired 10 years ago. You don't have any standing in this office. This is a private meeting for the Miller estate." "I am the executor of David Miller's private estate," Henderson said. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "And as of 8 o'clock this morning, I am also the legal representative for the majority shareholder of the building you are currently sitting in. So, if anyone doesn't have standing in this office, Arthur, it's probably you." The room went completely silent. The only sound was the ticking of a clock on the wall and the distant sound of a siren on the street below. Brenda stopped tapping her nails. The two lawyers in suits finally looked up from their tablets. Arthur looked like he had been slapped. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked at me, then at Henderson, then back at me. He looked like he was trying to solve a puzzle that was missing half its pieces. "What are you talking about?" Brenda snapped. "David didn't have any shares. He was just an employee of the firm. He didn't own anything." "That is where you are wrong, Brenda," I said. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. I felt the cold, confident energy of the secret strength David had left for me. My voice was calm and steady. "David didn't just work here. He bought the debt that your father used to build this firm. He bought the lease on this very floor through a private holding company 3 years ago. You've been paying rent to your brother for years, and you didn't even know it." Henderson nodded and slid a folder across the table toward the family trust lawyers. "You'll find the title and the debt purchase agreements in there. You'll also find a very interesting set of documents regarding the family home. It turns out the corporation lost the house in a tax lien 5 years ago. David bought it back personally. He didn't put it back in the family name. He put it in a trust for Savannah and Leo. So, Arthur, when you told Savannah she had to move out by the end of the month, You were actually threatening to trespass on her private property. Arthur's hand was shaking as he reached for the folder. He ripped it open and started flipping through the pages. His face went from red to a pale, sickly white. He looked like he was aging right in front of us. The arrogance that had been his armor for decades was cracking. He looked at his own lawyers, hoping they would tell him it was a lie, but they were busy reading the documents with looks of pure horror on their faces. They knew exactly what this meant. It meant the power had shifted. It meant the quiet daughter-in-law wasn't just a guest at the table anymore. I was the one who owned the room. The air in the room seemed to vanish as Arthur stared at the documents in front of him. I sat perfectly still, with my hands folded on the table. The hum of the high-powered air conditioner was the only sound in the office, and it felt like a cold wind blowing through a graveyard. Arthur was shaking his head back and forth, as if he could physically shake the truth out of his mind. He looked at the paper Henderson had produced, and then he looked at his own team of lawyers. Those men were usually so confident and so sharp, but now they looked like they wanted to crawl under the mahogany table. They were reading the clauses that David had hidden so well for so many years. Brenda was the first one to break the silence. "This is a lie," she screamed. Her voice was high and thin like a piece of glass scratching against metal. David did not have that kind of money. He was just a manager. He did not own anything. "You are making this up because you want to steal from us. You are just a nurse, Savannah. You do not understand how real business works." I looked at her and did not feel the usual sting of her insults. I felt a strange sense of calm. I noticed the way her expensive perfume was starting to mix with the smell of her sweat as she panicked. It was a sweet and sour smell that filled the space between us. I did not blink. I did not look away. "David understood exactly how business works, Brenda," I said. My voice was low and steady. It was the voice I used when I had to tell a parent that their child was going to be okay after a long surgery. "He understood that you and Arthur were spending money that did not exist. He understood that you were living a life you did not earn. He did not tell you about his investments because he knew you would try to take them. He knew you would see him as a bank instead of a brother." Arthur finally found his voice, but it was not the booming roar he had used at the funeral. It was a raspy whisper that sounded old and broken. "I built this company," he said. "I am the one who put the Miller name on this building. You cannot tell me that my own son was my landlord. It is impossible. It is illegal." Mr. Henderson leaned forward and adjusted his glasses. He looked like a teacher about to explain a very simple lesson to a very slow student. "It is not illegal, Arthur," he said. "David used his own personal earnings to buy the distressed debt of this firm 3 years ago when you were about to miss payroll. He did not use family funds. He used the money he made from his private tech investments. He did not want to see the family name dragged through a bankruptcy court, so he saved you. But he did it through a holding company called LM Properties. I assume you know what those initials stand for." Arthur's eyes widened as the realization hit him. LM stood for Leo Miller, my son. My husband had named his secret empire after our 7-year-old child. He had built a wall around us and named it after the person he loved most in the world. The lawyers for the family trust were whispering frantically to each other now. One of them, a man with a very expensive watch and a very nervous twitch in his eye, cleared his throat. "Mr. Miller, we need to speak privately," he said. "We were under the impression that the estate was fully consolidated under the trust. These documents suggest that the trust is actually a tenant of the LM Holding Group. If this is true, the trust owes several $1 million in back rent and maintenance fees." Brenda stood up and slammed her hands on the table. The sound was like a gunshot. "I do not care about holding groups. I care about the fact that she is trying to take my house. Dad, do something. Tell them they cannot do this." Arthur did not move. He was looking at the relinquishment of rights document that he had pushed toward me earlier. He looked at the check for $10,000. He looked at the silver pen he had expected me to use to sign my life away. He realized that the document was worthless. He realized that he was a man who had brought a knife to a fight where the other person already owned the building. "We are not finished," Henderson said. He pulled a second folder from his briefcase. "This is the final will of David Miller. It was drafted and signed 6 months ago in my presence. It was witnessed by 2 independent parties who have no connection to the Miller family. In this will, David explicitly states that he is aware of the financial mismanagement of the family trust. He outlines the embezzlement he discovered where funds were diverted to personal accounts belonging to Brenda Miller. Brenda turned pale. "That is a lie," she whispered. But she did not look at me. She looked at the floor. "David's will is very clear," Henderson continued. "He leaves his entire estate, including all shares of LM Holdings and all residential properties, to his wife, Savannah, and his son, Leo. He leaves Arthur and Brenda Miller the sum of $0. He also includes a very specific clause regarding the family home. Since Arthur and Brenda have been living there without paying a cent toward the mortgage or the taxes, David has left them a bill. He has calculated the fair market rent for the last 5 years. He is charging you for every single day you lived in that house, while he was quietly paying the bills for you." Arthur looked like he was having a heart attack. He grabbed the edge of the table and his knuckles turned white. He was breathing heavily, a wet and rattling sound that made the room feel even smaller. He tried to stand up, but his legs seemed to fail him. He sank back into the plush leather chair that David had technically paid for. "You cannot do this to me," Arthur wheezed. "I am his father. I am the patriarch." "You were a bully, Arthur," I said. I stood up slowly. I felt taller than I ever had in that office. I remembered how he had screamed at Leo at the funeral. I remembered how he had told me I was nothing. "You thought being a patriarch meant you could step on anyone you wanted. You thought that because I was quiet, I was weak." But David knew better. He knew that I would protect Leo no matter what it took. He knew that I was the only one who actually cared about his legacy. "You and Brenda just cared about the money." Brenda was crying now, but they were not real tears of grief. They were tears of anger and fear. She looked at the lawyers, begging them to find a loophole, but they were already packing up their tablets. They knew when a case was lost. They knew that David had built a trap that was impossible to escape. "What about the custody?" Brenda asked, her voice cracking. "You said she was unfit, Dad. You said we could take the kid and put him in school." "Tell them she is crazy." Mr. Henderson laughed. It was a short, sharp sound. "I have the medical records right here," he said. "I also have the recordings David made of your phone calls to the house. I have the evidence of you entering the property without permission and stealing a gold watch from a child's bedroom. If you want to talk about fitness, Brenda, we can talk about it in front of a judge who will be very interested in why a grown woman is stealing from a grieving 7-year-old. I looked at the relinquishment of rights paper one last time. I picked it up and slowly ripped it in half. Then I ripped it again. I let the pieces fall onto the mahogany table like snow. "I am not signing your papers, Arthur," I said. "I am not taking your $10,000, and I am not leaving my house. But you are. You and Brenda have 24 hours to pack your things and get out of the family estate. That house belongs to Leo now. I will have the locks changed tomorrow afternoon. If you are still there when the sun goes down, I will have you removed for trespassing." Arthur looked up at me, and for the first time in 10 years, I saw fear in his eyes. He saw that I was not the girl who had spent the holidays in the kitchen. He saw that I was the woman who had his entire future in my hands. He tried to speak, but he just made a small, choking noise. He looked at the favorite child, the one he always praised, and saw that she was just as broken as he was. They were two people who had built a life on a foundation of cruelty, and the foundation had finally collapsed. "The meeting is over," Mr. Henderson said. He stood up and closed his briefcase. The click of the latches was final. It sounded like the end of a story. I walked out of the conference room and did not look back. I could hear Brenda screaming behind me, but the sound was muffled by the heavy doors. I walked through the museum-like lobby and past the receptionist, who was now staring at me with wide, respectful eyes. I took the elevator down to the ground floor and stepped out into the bright sunlight. The air outside felt fresh and clean. I walked to my car and sat in the driver's seat for a moment. I looked at my hands and saw that they were perfectly still. I was a nurse. I had handled the emergency. I had saved the only thing that mattered. I walked out of the elevator and felt the heavy, humid air of the city hit my face like a damp towel. It was a strange contrast to the ice-cold temperature of the conference room I had just left. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, just breathing. People were rushing past me, heading to lunch or back to their offices, completely unaware that the world had shifted beneath my feet. I looked at the black glass of the building and realized that for the first time in 10 years, I did not feel like a ghost haunting the Miller family. I was the one who held the keys. I walked to my car, and my movements felt lighter. The weight that had been pressing down on my shoulders since David's funeral was gone, replaced by a quiet, vibrating energy. I sat in the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel. It was warm from the sun, and the leather felt real and solid. I started the engine and drove toward the neighbor's house to pick up Leo. I knew that the next 24 hours were going to be the hardest part of the fight, but I also knew that I had already won. When I picked up Leo, he was sitting on the porch with a toy airplane. He looked up at me, and his face brightened in a way I had not seen in weeks. He did not ask about the meeting. He just ran to me and wrapped his arms around my waist. I held him tightly, feeling his heartbeat against my ribs. I promised him right then that he would never have to be afraid of his grandfather again. I took him home, and as we pulled into our driveway, I looked at the house. It did not look like a corporate asset anymore. It looked like a sanctuary. I spent the afternoon making sure all the legal documents were in order. Mr. Henderson had given me a stack of papers that were basically eviction notices for the family estate. I called a locksmith and scheduled him for the following evening. I also called a private security firm. I knew Arthur would not go quietly. A man who has lived his entire life thinking he is a god does not suddenly accept that he is just a tenant. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose that was almost terrifying. I made breakfast for Leo and then drove him to my mother's house. I told her I needed him to stay there for the night. She saw the look in my eyes and did not ask questions. She just hugged me and told me she was proud of me. I drove toward the Miller estate, the massive white stone mansion that had always felt like a fortress designed to keep me out. As I drove up the winding driveway, I saw the moving trucks. Arthur had actually listened. Or maybe his lawyers had finally convinced him that he had no other choice. I parked my car and walked toward the front doors. The air was filled with the sound of heavy boxes being loaded into trucks and the shouting of movers. It was a chaotic, ugly scene that stripped the house of its dignity. I found Arthur standing in the grand foyer. He looked smaller than he had the day before. He was wearing a casual jacket and slacks, but he looked like he had not slept a minute. He was watching two men carry a large painting down the stairs. When he saw me, his face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. He walked over to me, his steps heavy and slow. He did not have the silver pen or the sharp suit to hide behind anymore. He was just an old man losing his grip on everything he loved. "You think you are so clever, Savannah," he spat. His voice was raw and thin. "You think you can just walk in here and erase 50 years of my work. You are a parasite. You are living off the hard work of a man you did not deserve. David was a fool to trust you, and he was a fool to hide things from me." I did not flinch. I did not let his words reach me. I looked him right in the eye, and for the first time, I felt nothing but pity for him. He was so consumed by his own ego that he could not even see how he had destroyed his own son's love. "David did not hide things because he was a fool, Arthur," I said. "He hid things because he knew exactly who you were. He knew that if you had the chance, you would have spent every dime he earned to cover your own failures. He saved this family, and you rewarded him by screaming at his son. You are not a builder. You are a predator who ran out of prey." Arthur raised his hand as if he were going to strike me, but he stopped. He saw the security guard standing by the door. He saw that the power dynamic had shifted completely. He lowered his hand and turned away, his shoulders slumped. He walked toward the door without saying another word. He did not look back at the house. He did not look back at the life he was leaving behind. He just walked out and got into a waiting black car. It was a silent, pathetic exit for a man who had tried to play God. Brenda was a different story. I found her in the library, trying to shove a set of silver bookends into a suitcase. She looked frantic and disheveled. Her hair was a mess, and her makeup was smeared from crying. When she saw me, she let out a shrill, hysterical laugh. She pointed at the shelves of books and the expensive furniture. "You want all this?" she screamed. "Take it. It is all cursed anyway. You think you are going to be happy here. You are just a nurse from a trailer park. You will never belong in this house. You will never be a Miller." I walked over to her and held out my hand. "Give it to me, Brenda," I said. My voice was cold and firm. I did not have to shout to be heard. "Give you what?" she snapped, clutching the silver bookends to her chest. "The watch," I said. "David's watch. I know you have it. If you do not give it to me right now, I will call the police and report you for theft. I have the security footage from my house, and I have the statement from my nanny. You can leave now with your dignity, or you can leave in handcuffs." Brenda's face went through a dozen different emotions in 5 seconds. She looked like she wanted to fight, then she looked like she was going to cry, and finally she looked defeated. She reached into her handbag and pulled out the gold watch. She did not hand it to me, she threw it on the floor. It made a dull thud on the rug. I picked it up carefully and wiped the dust off the glass. It was heavy and warm, and just holding it made me feel like David was standing right there with me. "Get out, Brenda," I whispered. She grabbed her suitcase and ran out of the room, her heels clicking loudly on the marble floor. I heard the front door slam, and then the house was quiet. The movers had finished their work and left. The security guards were standing at the gates. I was alone in the mansion. I walked through the rooms, looking at the empty spaces where the furniture had been. The house felt huge and hollow, but it also felt clean. The poison that Arthur and Brenda had brought into this place was gone. I walked out onto the terrace and looked out over the gardens. The sun was setting, and the sky was a deep, bruised purple. I thought about the future. I thought about the building downtown and the accounts David had left for us. We were not just rich, we were free. I spent the next few months turning the estate into something David would have been proud of. I did not keep the cold, museum-like furniture. I brought in comfortable chairs and bright rugs. I turned the grand dining room into a playroom for Leo. I hired a new staff, people who were kind and respected our privacy. I went back to work at the hospital part-time. People asked me why I still worked when I had millions of dollars. I told them that being a nurse was who I was. It was the thing that kept me grounded when the world felt too big. I did not want to become like Arthur, defined only by a bank account and a name. I wanted Leo to grow up knowing that hard work and kindness were more important than any title. Arthur and Brenda did not go quietly, of course. They tried to sue me several times, but Mr. Henderson shut them down at every turn. They had no leg to stand on. Arthur eventually had to sell his remaining assets to pay off the debts David had uncovered. He moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, far away from the high society circles he used to run. Brenda tried to start a lifestyle blog, but without the Miller money to fund her adventures, it failed within a few months. She stopped calling me after I blocked her number. They were gone from our lives, fading away like a bad dream. One afternoon, a few months after the move, I was sitting in the garden watching Leo play. He was running through the grass with a new puppy David had always promised him. He looked happy, he looked safe. I looked down at the gold watch on my wrist and felt a sense of peace. David had seen the storm coming, and he had built a lighthouse for us. He had loved us enough to fight a war he never wanted to be a part of. I realized then that I was not just the woman who protected his legacy. I was the woman who lived it. I was a mother, a nurse, and a fighter. They tried to bury me and my son along with David, but they forgot one very important thing. They forgot that David loved us more than he ever feared them. I am not just a nurse or a widow anymore. I am the woman who stood my ground, and because of that, my son has a future they can never touch. Have you ever had a family member try to take advantage of you when you were at your lowest? It is a pain that cuts deep, but standing your ground changes everything. My story is a reminder that you are stronger than you think, and that truth eventually finds its way to the light. Share your story of standing up to a favored sibling or a toxic parent in the comments below. I want to hear how you found your strength. Click hype to help this story reach others who need it. If this story resonated with you, do not forget to subscribe for more real-life accounts of justice and resilience. Your support helps us keep sharing these powerful journeys and building a community where everyone's voice matters. We are reading every comment and appreciate every person who joins us here. Thanks for being part of our community today, and I will see you in the next one. Take care of yourself.